The night, Beatrice Arden pressed her hand flat against the cold marble pillar and watched a vampire prince walk through a room full of his own subjects without a single one of them turning their head. She understood for the first time the true depth of the curse that had swallowed Dorian De Vries whole. 300 vampires filled the grand ballroom beneath the Meridian Hotel in downtown Vienna, and not one of them saw him. Lords and ladies, in their ancient finery, their white hair swept into elaborate crowns, their pale skin catching the gold chandeliers overhead, swept past him like he was made of air. A minor countess walked directly through the space he occupied, and he had to sidestep with that terrible, controlled grace of his, and still no one flinched, no one apologized, no one acknowledged that the heir to the house of De Vries, the most ancient bloodline in the vampire world, was standing among them. But Beatrice saw him. She had always seen him. She saw the way his jaw tightened each time a subject swept past without recognition. She saw the way his hands, long-fingered and marble-pale, curled into fists at his sides before he deliberately opened them again, refusing to show the wound. She saw the flash of silver in his dark eyes, the color of storm clouds over an immortal sea, and she recognized it for what it was. He was not angry. He was devastated. And then those storm-colored eyes found her across the ballroom, across 300 oblivious aristocrats who had erased him from their perception because an ancient blood law had declared it so, and the devastation in them shifted into something far more dangerous. He crossed the room toward her in 12 steps, silent, and every step felt like a countdown to something she could not name. "You are not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was low and precise, the kind of voice that had once commanded armies and silenced courts, and the fact that he lowered it now, just for her, made something in her chest pull tight. "Neither are you," Beatrice said. "Technically." His mouth curved barely, but she caught it. "You heard about the conclave's ruling," she said. "It was not a question that my presence is to be tolerated, but not acknowledged." Yes, he said it so flatly it should have sounded like indifference, and on any other face it might have. "My own conclave declared that I do not exist as heir until I reclaim the seeing throne. Until then, I am shadow only. The blood law erases me from the perception of those who serve my house." He glanced across the ballroom, and in that glance was 3 centuries of something she could only call grief. "They cannot see me, Beatrice. Not one of them. I can see you," she said. He looked back at her then, and the storm in his eyes deepened. "I know," he said. "That has always been the most extraordinary thing about you." She had met Dorian De Vries 11 months ago, and the memory of it sat in her body like a lodged piece of shrapnel, something sharp and permanent that she had learned to move around, rather than remove. She had been in Vienna, representing the Arden Accord, the formal arrangement that had kept the human world's oldest sovereign families in a position of careful, watchful diplomacy with the vampire courts of Europe for the better part of 2 centuries. Her family, the Ardens, had served as primary human liaisons to the De Vries court since her grandmother's time. Beatrice had grown up learning Old Vrath, the formal language of vampire nobility, had memorized the blood laws the way other children memorized fairy tales, and had walked into her role as Heiress of the Accord with the certainty of someone who had been preparing for a role her entire life. She had not been prepared for him. She had walked into the De Vries estate on the outskirts of Vienna on a cold October afternoon, expected to meet the regent, an elder vampire named Casimir Vrail, for a treaty renewal. She had been directed to the library on the 3rd floor, a room the size of a cathedral all dark wood and the smell of old paper, and something that she had come to understand later was the specific, almost metallic sweetness of vampire habitation. She had set her briefcase on the reading table and begun arranging documents, and she had looked up to find a man standing at the far window. He was very tall. He wore a dark coat that belonged to this century, and a white shirt that somehow suggested every century before it. His hair was white as bone, worn loose to his jaw, and his skin was the particular shade of pale that Beatrice had learned to recognize as the mark of a vampire who was genuinely old, not turned last century old, ancient. He was looking out the window at the estate gardens, and he had not turned when she entered. And something about the set of his shoulders told her he had known she was there from the moment she climbed the stairs. "You are the Arden girl," he said. "I am Beatrice Arden, Heiress of the Accord," she said, because she had been called the Arden girl by dismissive vampire courtiers before, and she knew how to correct it without aggression. "And you are not Regent Casimir Vrale." He turned then the storm-colored eyes, the barely there mouth curve, the presence of him like standing near a cliff edge, something vast and ancient and genuinely powerful, just beneath the surface of a composed exterior. "No," he said, "I am not. I am Dorian De Vries, and I have been waiting 11 years for a human diplomat with enough spine to correct my court before the first treaty clause is even opened." She had said something sharp back. He had matched it. They had spent 4 hours in that library and signed nothing, because the negotiation became a conversation, and the conversation became an argument about the Third Blood Law's interpretation, and the argument became the most intellectually alive Beatrice had felt in years. When she finally left the estate in the gathering dark, briefcase in hand, cheeks flushed, she had sat in her car in the long driveway and pressed both hands against the steering wheel and thought very clearly, "That man is going to change everything." She had been right, and she had not yet known the half of it. The ballroom in the Meridian Hotel was the site of the Autumn Conclave, the quarterly gathering of all major vampire houses of Central Europe, and Beatrice was here in her official capacity as the Accord's representative, seated at the human delegation table in the gallery above the floor. She should not have come down. She had come down because she had seen Dorian enter, and she had watched every vampire in the room fail to see him, and she had not been able to stay in her gallery seat while he stood alone in that crowd. "How long has it been in effect?" she asked now. "The erasure ruling?" He said the words like they tasted of metal. "Since the night my father's regent court declared that I was not fit to hold the heir's position without first claiming the seeing throne. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, she said. And before that I was merely heir apparent to a court in political chaos." His tone was controlled, but she heard the edge under it, the way she always heard the things he kept beneath the composed surface. "My father, the king, fell into the voidal sleep 4 months ago. A coma of the blood. It happens to very old vampires under sufficient stress. The regent court was established to rule in his name. Casimir Vrale sits at its head, and Casimir Vrale has never wanted me to inherit. Because I have spent 11 years negotiating with humans, instead of consolidating power within the court." He said it without self-pity. "Because I believe the accord your family maintains is the most important political relationship this court has ever had. Because I think the isolation of the vampire world is not strength, it is a slow extinction." He looked at her steadily. "And because I am in love with the human heiress, which Vrale considers the most profound betrayal of immortal pride he has ever witnessed. The words landed between them like something thrown from a great height. He had said it before. He said things like that with the directness that still surprised her, even now, because everything about him suggested a man who controlled every word he spoke, and when he chose to say something like that, she felt it in her bones. "Dorian," she started. "Do not tell me to be cautious," he said. "I have been cautious for 11 years. I have attended every conclave. I have upheld every blood law. I have treated this court with more honor than it has ever treated me, and Casimir Vrail has used every one of those years to build a case against my legitimacy." He paused. "I am done being cautious." She looked up at him, at the particular way the ballroom's gold light moved over the angular planes of his face, and she thought about what it meant to be seen, not just looked at, actually seen, the way she had always been able to see him, past the regal armor and the controlled composure, all the way to the person underneath, who was brilliant and lonely and fighting a battle that had been designed to make him invisible. "Tell me about the Seeing Throne," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "It is the original throne of my bloodline, not the ceremonial seat in the court hall which my father still technically occupies in the sleep. The Seeing Throne is older. It predates this estate. It predates Vienna itself. Legend holds that a De Vries heir who claims it becomes visible to all blood-bound subjects, regardless of any ruling or blood law to the contrary." His mouth tightened. "It is located in the first De Vries hold, the old fortress beneath the Viennese Alps, sealed for over 400 years. Sealed by what? By a blood compact. The original De Vries monarch sealed it against all bloodkin after a succession war that nearly destroyed the house." He met her eyes. "Only someone who carries no De Vries blood can open the seal." The silence between them carried the full weight of that. "A human," she said. "Yes, Vrail knows this. Vrail has known this for as long as I have." His voice was very quiet now. "Which is why the first thing he did, after establishing the erasure ruling, was restrict all human access to the estate and formally revoke the Accord's diplomatic access rights for the duration of the regency. He watched her process this. He is not trying to take my place, Beatrice. He cannot take my place. He is trying to ensure I can never reclaim it." It hit her then, the full architecture of it, the trap within the trap within the trap. Vrail had used the erasure ruling not just to humiliate Dorian, but to physically erase him from the power structure, while simultaneously cutting off the one means by which Dorian could restore himself. And he had done it in a way that was technically legal under the blood laws, using the very laws Dorian had always respected as the bars of a cage. "How did you get in tonight?" she asked. "I have not been erased from human perception, only from those blood-bound to my house." A dark glimmer of something that was almost satisfaction moved through his eyes. "The Meridian is a neutral venue. Vrail does not own these walls. I walked in through the front entrance because the human staff held the door for me." She almost smiled. "You walked into the autumn conclave through the human entrance and went entirely unnoticed by 300 of my father's subjects." The almost satisfaction died. "Which tells you something about the completeness of what has been done to me." Beatrice looked past him at the ballroom floor, at the elegant, oblivious crowd, at Casimir Vrail himself, standing near the far platform with 2 of his council members. Vrail was older than Dorian, perhaps by a century, and it showed in the particular quality of his stillness, the kind of absolute physical control that very old vampires developed. He was white-haired like all of them, tall, and he wore his authority like a second skin. He was also, she had always believed, one of the most genuinely dangerous individuals she had ever been in a room with. He had not looked at her yet tonight. That was also information. "He knows I am here," she said. "He knew the moment you descended from the gallery. He will let you reach me before he acts. He wants to see what we do. Then we should do something unexpected." Dorian looked at her with that expression she had learned over 11 months, the one where something behind his eyes recalibrated. "What do you have in mind?" he said. "How far are the Alps from here?" The very slight widening of his eyes was the closest he came to surprise. 3 hours by road. There are faster routes if one is not concerned with being observed. "Then we leave now," she said. "Before Vrail finishes whatever calculation he is running." "You understand what you are volunteering for," he said. It was not a question. There was something in his voice that she recognized as the way he felt when she did something that mattered to him, a careful warmth held under pressure. "I understand that there is an ancient throne in a sealed fortress that only I can open, and that the man I intend to see properly crowned is standing in front of me while 300 people look through him." She met his gaze fully. "I am the Heiress of the Accord, Dorian. My entire bloodline has spent 200 years building a relationship between our worlds. Tell me exactly which part of this you think I am going to back away from." For one moment, something moved across his face that was entirely unguarded, something honest and enormous and tender, and she held it the way she would hold a lit match in a dark room. "Stay close to me," he said. "I always do," she said. They moved for the exit. Casimir Vrail did not stop them in the ballroom. He let them reach the lobby, let them collect their coats from the human attendant near the door, let them get almost to the street before the doors. Behind them opened and 2 members of his council appeared, with the particular silence of very old vampires moving at purpose. Beatrice felt Dorian's hand at her elbow guiding her left into the narrow passage beside the hotel rather than out to the open street. His grip was firm without being rough, the way he always touched her, with a deliberateness that said he had thought about exactly how much pressure was appropriate and was applying precisely that. "Radu and Seraphin," he said quietly. "Vrail's senior enforcers. Do not look back." She did not look back. She let him guide her through the passage, past the service entrance, into the alley that ran behind the hotel row. The night air was cold and sharp and smelled of Vienna in late November, stone and river, and the particular diesel sweetness of a city that had been burning fuel across multiple centuries. "My car is on the next block," she said. "We will not reach it. Radu is faster than any vehicle in a close space." He turned the Megan through an arched gate she had not seen, into a private courtyard. "I need a moment." "For what?" He turned to face her, and in the yellow light of the courtyard's single lantern, she saw something in his expression that was both very controlled and very urgent. "If we do this," he said, "if you go to the old hold and open that seal, there is no version of tonight where you remain uninvolved in what comes after. Vrail will classify you as a hostile actor under the blood laws. Your diplomatic immunity from the Accord will protect you from vampire retribution in theory, but Vrail does not operate in theory. I need you to understand it," she said. "Beatrice." His voice dropped to something that was barely above the ambient sound of the city. "I have spent 3 months trying to find a way to do this without involving you. I have looked at every alternative. There is no other non-bloodkin individual with the standing to approach the seal that would not give Vrail grounds to declare the claiming fraudulent. The blood compact requires not just a human hand, but a human of demonstrable honor and standing in the diplomatic record. His jaw tightened. It requires you specifically, or someone very much like you, and there is no one like you. She felt the weight of it. The fact that he had spent 3 months trying to protect her from exactly this, and found no way clear. "You should have told me," she said. "I know. 3 months ago, you should have told me, and we should have done this 3 months ago, before Vrail had time to position himself. I know that too. You were trying to keep me out of it, yes." Simply, without apology, but with an honesty that sat between them like something solid. "I was trying to keep you out of it, because I knew what it would cost you, and I did not want to ask you to pay it. The accord, your diplomatic standing, the political position your family has maintained for 2 centuries, all of it will be in question after tonight." She looked at him in the lantern light for a long moment. "My grandmother told me something when I was 15, she said. She said the accord was never a document. It was never a treaty or a clause or a diplomatic position. She said the accord was a promise that when the moment came that mattered, the Ardens would not flinch. She held his gaze. "This is that moment, Dorian. I am not flinching." Something crossed his face that she thought, if pressed, she would have called reverence. "I will protect you," he said. "Every step, whatever comes. I know you will," she said. "Now, how do we get to the Alps before Vrail's enforcers catch up?" He allowed himself one full, quiet breath, and then that composure she both admired and occasionally wanted to shake him out of settled back into place, but warmer now, with something personal threaded through it. "There is a De Vries safe house 4 minutes from here on foot," he said. "A car, a clear road, and 3 hours. Let us go," she said. The journey into the Alps was the kind of drive that happened between 2 people who had been carefully not saying things to each other for 11 months. They took the old route, the B-roads that curled up into the mountain darkness, and Beatrice drove because Dorian's relationship with modern vehicles was, as she had discovered on exactly one prior occasion, one of his few genuine weak points. He sat in the passenger's seat looking entirely too large and elegant for a car that cost 40,000 euros, and for the first hour they talked logistics. He told her about the old fortress, called Vrathalten in the ancient tongue, which translated roughly as the hold of the first seeing. It had been built in the 13th century by the original De Vries line, before the family had fully integrated into the vampire court system of Europe. It sat inside a mountain, which was, as Dorian explained it, not unusual for a fortress built by creatures to whom sunlight was genuinely dangerous. The entrance was accessible through a cave system in a valley he knew well, and the De Vries blood in him would open the outer gates, while her human hand and her standing as an acknowledged diplomat of the accord would open the inner seal. He told her that the seeing throne was not a metaphor. It was a literal throne of black stone, older than the estate, older than the court system, and the blood law attached to it, held that any De Vries heir who sat upon it was instantly and permanently restored to visibility in the eyes of all blood-bound subjects. Regardless of any subsequent ruling, she told him about the documents she had in her briefcase, the ones she had brought to the conclave. Renewal clauses, yes, but also something else. The Arden Accord's original founding text, which she had obtained from her grandmother's private archive. The text contained a clause that had never been formally exercised, one that allowed the Heiress of the Accord to formally recognize and legitimize a vampire heir in the event of a contested succession. It had been written, her grandmother had told her, for exactly this kind of situation. Dorian went very still when she told him. Your grandmother wrote that clause, he said. She wrote it after she met your father, when he was young, and the court was in chaos for different reasons. Beatrice kept her eyes on the mountain road. She said she knew there would come a day when the De Vries line would need a friend with a pen and enough standing to make it mean something. She never told my father. She did not want him to feel obligated to us for a kindness she had not yet given. She paused. That is the Arden way. You put the tool in the drawer, and you do not mention the drawer until someone needs what is inside. He was quiet for a moment that felt significant. What would exercising that clause require of you? A formal statement in writing, co-signed by me as acting Heiress, recognizing you as legitimate heir to the De Vries bloodline and throne. Submitted to the International Covenant, the governing body that sits above all individual vampire courts. She kept her voice steady. Vrail cannot override the International Covenant. No regent court can. It was designed precisely to prevent one faction from dismantling a legitimate succession. If you do this, the Covenant will require testimony from you in person. You will be in the vampire court structure, officially and on record, in a way that goes far beyond diplomatic liaison. Yes, Vrail will consider it an act of war. Vrail, she said evenly, is currently invisibling a prince and hoping no one withstanding notices. He is not in a strong position to declare war on anyone. Another silence, shorter this time. You have been planning this, he said. I have been prepared for this, she corrected gently. There is a difference. Planning implies I knew when. I only knew the drawer would eventually need to be opened. He turned his head to look at her profile in the dark of the car, and she felt the weight of his attention the way she always did, like warm pressure against the side of her face. Beatrice, I need to tell you something. You can tell me while I navigate this switchback. The road is getting narrow. A pause in which she could feel him choosing words with the care he always brought to moments that mattered. I have loved you, he said. Since the 3rd hour of that first meeting in my father's library, when you told me that the Third Blood Law's historical interpretation was the intellectual equivalent of letting a textbook written in the wrong century drive a car. I have loved you since before I had any right to say it. I have spent 11 months being careful about saying it because I did not want it to be a pressure on you, given everything. Given the politics, the blood law barriers, the fact that I am what I am. His voice was low and even and utterly unperformed. But we are driving into a mountain in the middle of the night to commit what Casimir Vrail will call high treason, and I find I am done waiting for a better moment. Her hands were steady on the wheel. Her heart was doing something complicated and luminous behind her ribs. I have loved you since you looked at me across a room full of aristocrats who wanted me to be decorative, and used the word spine in your first sentence to me, she said. I have loved you since you argued with me for 4 hours and never once talked down to me. I have loved you since I realized that the most powerful vampire I had ever met was also the most genuinely lonely person I had ever known, and that he was letting me see that, and that it was the most trusting thing anyone had ever done for me. She navigated the switchback, the road leveling briefly before climbing again. I know what I am doing tonight, Dorian. I know all the costs. I am not here because of the accord or my grandmother's clause. I am here because it is you, and I would not be anywhere else. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet, and had something in it she had never quite heard before, the sound of a man who had not believed fully in the possibility of something until it was actually standing in front of him. We get through tonight, he said. and then we figure out what after looks like." "We will," she said. "I have been thinking about after for 11 months." The fortress entrance was exactly as he had described it, a valley tucked between two peaks, accessible by a trail that no satellite map bothered with, and a cave mouth behind a boulder that moved under his hand with the particular mechanical elegance of old engineering that had never needed maintaining because it had been made to last. The caves went deep, and the air changed as they descended, becoming colder and carrying that metallic sweetness more strongly, the smell of vampire antiquity. Dorian moved through the dark with the absolute confidence of someone to whom darkness was simply not an obstacle, and he kept her close with one hand, not gripping her arm but touching the backs of her knuckles with his fingertips, a steady warmth in the cold air. She could not see much past the small light of her phone's torch, but she followed his direction without question, because this was the thing about Dorian De Vries that she had known from the beginning. He did not guide her because he thought she needed guiding. He guided her because he knew this particular darkness, and she did not. And there was a difference between protection born of condescension and protection born of a genuine desire to keep something precious from harm. She had never, not once in 11 months, felt the former from him. The inner gate of Rathalton appeared after 20 minutes of descent, and it was remarkable even in the narrow beam of her phone light. Black stone carved with symbols she recognized as pre-Accord Vrath, the oldest written form of the vampire formal language, worn smooth in places by what must have been centuries of accumulated pressure. The gate stood floor to ceiling, perhaps 15 feet, and at its center was an impression in the stone that looked, in the most deliberate possible way, like a human hand. Dorian stood before it, and she felt the tension in him, the stillness that was the opposite of ease. "If this does not work," he said. "It will work," she said. "You cannot know that. I know that my grandmother was an exceptionally precise woman who would not have written a clause for a situation she did not believe would be resolvable." She looked up at him. "She believed in your family, Dorian. She believed in this, and she believed that an Arden would be standing exactly here when it mattered." His throat moved. For 1 second, the regal composure was entirely absent, and there was just a man who had been erased by his own world, looking at someone who had always seen him clearly, and the tenderness on his face was almost too much to look at directly. "Place your hand," he said. She pressed her palm flat against the carved impression. The stone was cold, and then it was not cold. It warmed under her hand in a way that was not temperature, but something else, like recognition, like the rock itself was identifying her, running some ancient diagnostic that checked her against a list compiled 400 years ago by a vampire monarch who had known, somehow, that this day would come. She felt it move from her palm up her wrist and her forearm, not unpleasant but enormous, like being read in a language that predated language. Then the gate opened, not sliding, not swinging. It simply ceased to be an obstacle. The stone divided along invisible seams and folded back into itself, and the passage beyond it blazed with a pale blue light that had no visible source. Dorian exhaled one long, slow breath. They walked through. The throne room of Rathalton was nothing like the estate above Vienna. It was carved from living rock, the ceiling arching high and irregular, the blue light emanating from veins in the stone itself, some phosphorescent mineral or some old blood magic. She could not be certain. It was enormous and cold and entirely silent, and at its center on a raised dais of black stone sat the seeing throne. It was not beautiful in any way she would have ordinarily used the word. It was authority made physical. Black stone, worked into something that suggested both rest and judgment, carved with the same pre-accord symbols as the gate, worn smooth at the arms from centuries of hands that may or may not have ever held this particular rite. It had a presence the way that very old, very significant things had presence, the accumulated weight of everything that had ever been decided near them. She looked at Dorian beside her, and he was looking at the throne with an expression that contained the whole of what had been done to him in the last 3 weeks, and the whole of what he had been before it, and the whole of what he could still become. And she thought that she had never, in her life, been so certain of anything as she was of standing here, of having driven 3 hours into the Alps, and opened an ancient gate, of what she was about to do with her grandmother's claws, and her own signature, and the full weight of the Arden name behind her. "Sit down," she said softly. He looked at her. "Your throne," she said. "Sit down." He walked to the dais. He climbed the 3 steps. He sat. The moment he settled into the stone, the blue light in the room intensified, flooding from the veins in the rock with a brightness that made her blink. The symbols on the throne blazed the same pale blue and then faded back to dark. The air in the room changed, pressurized and then released, like something that had been held for a very long time letting go. He sat straight in the throne with his white hair and his pale skin and his storm-colored eyes, and he looked, in that moment, exactly like what he was. The air of the most ancient bloodline in the vampire world, visible at last, undeniable, and hers. She opened her briefcase on the cave floor and took out the document she had carried to the conclave and never expected to use tonight. She wrote quickly, the formal statement of recognition in both English and Old Vrath, because the Accord's founding text required it to be bilingual. She signed her name at the bottom with the pen her grandmother had given her at 16, a plain silver pen that had signed more significant papers than she could count. Then she took out her phone and photographed every page and sent the photographs to 3 separate email addresses. The International Covenant's formal submission portal, her family's legal firm in London, and a journalist at a major European newspaper whose name she had kept in her contacts for exactly this kind of moment. She looked up and found Dorian watching her from the throne. "The Covenant has the documents," she said. "My family's lawyers have a copy, and a journalist with deep contacts in both the human governance and vampire diplomatic community has the 3rd copy with a 24-hour embargo and instructions to publish if she does not hear from me by morning." He stared at her. "The journalist is a friend of mine from university," she added. "She has been waiting 3 years for me to give her something good." "You sent the Covenant documents while standing in a cave," he said. "Good mobile reception up here, actually. The mountains bounce the signals surprisingly well." She dropped the documents back into the briefcase and closed it. "Vrail cannot suppress it now, even if he moves against us tonight. The Covenant has a legal obligation to process a recognized succession claim within 48 hours. His regent court has no standing to interfere with a Covenant review." "You thought of all of this," he said. "I had 3 months," she said. "While you were trying to protect me by not telling me, I was preparing for every possible version of tonight, including the versions where things went wrong." He rose from the throne slowly and descended the steps, and when he reached her, he stopped with perhaps 2 feet between them, and she tipped her head back to look at him, because he was very tall and very close, and his expression was doing several things at once, none of them controlled all of them real. You have always been 10 steps ahead of every room you walk into, he said. 12, usually, she said. And you have always made it look effortless. It is not effortless. It is prepared. She held his gaze. There is a difference. He reached out, and his hand, that marble-pale, careful hand, cupped the side of her face with a gentleness that was somehow more arresting than anything physically imposing could have been. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, light and deliberate the way he did everything. I have wanted to do this, he said, for 11 months. I know, she said. I have been waiting 11 months. He kissed her the way she had imagined he would, which was carefully and completely, not tentative but not rushing. A kiss that said, I have thought about this, and I am choosing it fully, a kiss with the weight of every carefully restrained moment of the past year behind it. She put her hands against his chest and felt through his coat the absolute steadiness of him. The warmth that was different from human warmth, cooler at the surface, but somehow deeply warm underneath, like something preserved at the right temperature to last forever. When they separated, she kept her hands where they were, and he kept his where they were, and they looked at each other in the blue light of the oldest De Vries throne room, and she thought that this was the kind of moment that she would be able to recall with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. Every detail, the cold air, the light in the stone, the way his eyes looked up close, storm-colored, and currently doing something that looked a great deal like joy. We should go back up, she said. Not moving. We should, he agreed. Not moving. Rail will have moved by now. Yes, his hands, finally, slowly, dropped from her face. And I should be visible to his enforcers when they find us. The seeings is done. Rowan Seraphin cannot carry out the erasure ruling any longer. It is overridden. Whatever Rail does next, he will be doing it in full view of the blood laws he has been hiding behind. She stepped back and picked up her briefcase. Then let us give him the opportunity. The drive back to Vienna was different from the drive out. The mountain roads felt shorter somehow, or perhaps time simply moved differently when you had done the thing you came to do. Dorian sat in the passenger seat looking out at the pre-dawn darkness of the Alpine descent, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that she recognized as a man who had just set down something he had been carrying for a very long time. My father, he said at one point, unprompted, when he wakes from the voidal sleep, will the Covenant's ruling affect his court before he wakes? It will take effect immediately upon Covenant processing. The Regent Court's authority was always provisional. Once the Covenant formally recognizes me as heir, Vrail's entire legal standing evaporates. He paused. My father will wake to a court that has been restored. What is he like? Your father? A silence that felt fond rather than difficult. Old, he said, in the way that makes other old things seem recent. He was a fair king in his time. Not warm, but fair. He believed in the accord before I did. Another pause. He will be furious that I waited so long to act. Tell him his heir was being careful with a human heiress's safety, and see how furious he stays. She felt his attention shift to her. You are remarkably good at knowing what to say. I have been told that before. I have never entirely believed it. I mostly just say what seems true. That is rarer than you think. They reached Vienna as the sky began its first grey lightening toward dawn, and Dorian directed her, not to the Meridian, but to an address in the 4th District, a townhouse with iron gates and absolutely no external signage, which she pulled up to and stopped. A safe house, she asked, a private De Vries property not registered under the estate's name. Vrail does not know it exists. He reached past her and opened his door, then came around and opened hers. He offered his hand. The sun will be up in 40 minutes. I need the shielded interior. She took his hand and he led her inside. The townhouse was not large by vampire court standards, but it was immaculate. All dark wood and old furnishings, and the characteristic scent of De Vries' habitation, a room that had been lived in by something ancient and careful. There was a sitting room, a kitchen she suspected he had never used, and he pointed her to the kitchen with instructions to eat something if she was hungry. He was reasonably certain there were provisions because he restocked this place quarterly. She found bread and cheese and a bottle of wine that turned out to be extraordinarily good, the kind of wine that cost what she spent on rent, which she supposed was consistent with the quarterly resupply habits of a vampire prince. She made herself a plate and sat at the kitchen table and heard him moving in the next room, and after a few minutes he appeared in the doorway. "You should sleep," he said. "The Covenant will not respond before business hours in Brussels. I am too alert to sleep." She held up the wine. "Sit with me." He sat opposite her at the kitchen table, which was a thing she had never seen him do. Sit in a kitchen like a person, and it should have been unremarkable, but was not. He rested his arms on the table and looked at her, and she looked back. "Tell me something I do not know about you," she said. "You know a great deal about me. Tell me something I do not know." He considered. "I learned to read in 6 languages before I was made, when I was still human. The first 3 books I ever read were a Latin agricultural manual, a Greek philosophical text, and what I later realized was a quite lurid French romance novel that had been misfilled in my family's library." His mouth curved. "I have had complicated feelings about French literature ever since." She laughed genuinely, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere relaxed and real, and she watched something in his posture settle at the sound of it. "When were you made?" she asked. 1692. I was 23 years old." He said it without drama. "It was not my choice initially. The De Vries line had a tradition at the time of bringing exceptional individuals into the blood to preserve useful minds. I had been working as a political advisor to a minor court. Dorian De Vries, my maker and the vampire I would eventually to come to consider something like a father before the present king was born, decided I was exceptional. The slight self-deprecation in his tone was affectionate rather than bitter. I was furious about it for approximately 40 years, and then I realized I had outlived everyone who had ever frustrated me, and I found it clarifying." She laughed again. He watched her laugh with that careful attentiveness he always brought to moments he seemed to be filing away. "Tell me something I do not know about you," he said. She thought. "I was afraid of the dark until I was 14, she said, mortifyingly, given that I was being raised to work with vampires, who tend to be associated with darkness as a matter of course. I used to leave a light on in my bedroom and feel deeply ashamed about it." She picked up the wine glass. "My grandmother found out, and instead of being reassuring about it, she sat me down and told me that the dark was afraid of me, which was the most absurd possible thing to say, and also the most effective. Is that when you stopped being afraid?" "That is when I decided to act as though I had stopped being afraid. The actual absence of fear came gradually." She met his eyes over the wine glass. "I think that is mostly how bravery works. You perform it until it becomes true." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been performing composure," he said. "For 330 years, I am not always certain where performance ends." "I know where it ends," she said. I can see exactly where it ends. I have always been able to see exactly where it ends. Something in his face went entirely still, and then entirely not still, and he reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his. I know you can, he said. That has never stopped being extraordinary to me. They sat like that in the kitchen in the townhouse, in the 4th district, as the Vienna dawn arrived outside the shuttered windows, and she ate bread and cheese and wine, and he sat with her in the way that very old beings could sit, without restlessness, without the human fidget of unfilled time, simply present, watching her with those storm-colored eyes that she thought she could spend a very long time looking back at. The Covenant's response came at 9 in the morning. She was awake and he was in the interior room where the shielded windows kept the daylight out, and she took the call on speaker so he could hear through the wall. The Covenant's formal registrar, a brisk woman in Brussels named Coordinator Esvelt, informed her that the succession documentation had been received, verified against the Accord's founding record, and was being processed under the emergency succession clause that required a 48-hour ruling. Casimir Vavrail and the Regent Court had already submitted a formal protest, which had been logged and would be reviewed as part of the same process. Beatrice was thanked for her prompt submission and told that she would receive a formal ruling no later than midnight the following day. When she ended the call, Dorian said through the wall, "He was faster than I expected. He must have had people monitoring the Covenant's submission portal," she said. "He was prepared for this, which means he knew it was possible, which means he was always afraid of it." A pause. "Good. What do you need from me for the Covenant's review period?" "Nothing you have not already done. The documents are sufficient. The Covenant's process is formal, and Vrail cannot corrupt it. The membership is too broad, and the oversight too distributed." Another pause, and then, "Thank you, Beatrice. Stop thanking me. I will stop when I feel it has been adequately expressed. At 330 years of age, your sense of adequate expression may outlast my patience for receiving it." A quiet sound through the wall that she was almost certain was a laugh. The 48 hours that followed were not quiet. Vrail moved publicly, submitting formal statements to the vampire diplomatic press, deploying his council members to lobby Covenant member courts, and at one point sending Radu himself to the townhouse address, which meant he had found it after all, or found it during the 2 days. Since she and Dorian had arrived there, Radu knocked on the front door at 2 in the afternoon on the first day, which was, Beatrice noted when she answered it, an interesting tactical choice, because it meant he had come during daylight hours, knowing full well that Dorian could not come to the door without risking the sun through an open frame. Radu was older looking than she had expected, which with vampires was always a meaningful observation. Very old vampires could choose to appear at whatever age they had been made, and the fact that Radu chose to look 60 meant something about how he wanted to project authority. He was solid and pale and expressionless in the way that very old predators were expressionless, which was not blankness, but absolute management, Miss Arden. He said, "The Regent Casimir Vrail requests your attendance at the estate at your earliest convenience." "That is kind of him," she said. "Please tell the Regent that I am currently occupied with processing obligations under the International Covenant's succession review, and that I will be happy to arrange a formal meeting once the review ruling has been issued." She held his gaze. "Also please tell him that this address and all communications to and from it are being monitored by the Covenant's independent review team, which was the first thing I arranged after submitting the documents this morning." Radu looked at her for a moment with absolutely no expression. "The regent will hear your response," he said. "I am confident he will," she said pleasantly. She closed the door and leaned her back against it and exhaled. Dorian's voice came from the interior room. "You told him the address was being monitored." "It is not," she said. "But Vrail does not know that, and it will make him cautious about the next 46 hours, which is all I need." Another of those through-the-wall sounds that she was increasingly confident was laughter. "You," he said. "Ah, remarkable." "I am practical," she said. "Same thing, different name." The Covenant's ruling arrived at 11:47 in the evening on the second day, 48 hours and 13 minutes after her submission. She was sitting in the townhouse's sitting room with her laptop open and the case file on screen, and Dorian was sitting across from her because it was night, and the shutters were open and the city came in through the old windows in sounds and light. She read it out loud. "The International Covenant of Blood and Standing, having reviewed the succession documentation submitted by Beatrice Arden, recognized Heiress of the Arden Accord, pursuant to the founding text's bilateral recognition clause, hereby ruled as follows. First, Dorian De Vries was recognized as legitimate heir to the De Vries bloodline and throne, with all rights, precedents, and legal standing attendant thereto, effective immediately. Second, the Regent Court's erasure ruling was found to have exceeded the legal authority of a provisional regency under the Covenant's precedent statute, and was therefore void. Third, Casimir Vrail's tenure as regent was suspended pending a full review of all actions taken during the regency, with an independent Covenant auditor to be appointed within 7 days. She looked up from the screen. Dorian was very still. "Vrail is suspended," she said. "Yes, your erasure ruling is void." "Yes, you are recognized heir." "Yes." He said it very quietly, and it contained 330 years of being invisible in one way or another. 3 centuries of being what he was, and not quite fitting the shape that the world had made for what he was, and the 11 months of watching him be precise and careful and brilliant and alone that she had spent, and the 2 days of this particular crisis, all of it was in that one small word. She closed the laptop. She crossed the room. She put her arms around him without preamble and held him with the specific intention of simply being a body that was present and warm and not going anywhere. And after one moment's stillness, he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her in and held her back with a steadiness that was somehow both gentle and total. They stayed like that for a long time. "It is not over," he said eventually into her hair. "Vrail will appeal. The audit will be unpleasant. My father's court will need to be rebuilt from a new foundation. There are blood law implications to almost everything that happened this week that will take years to properly adjudicate." I know," she said. "Your diplomatic standing is going to be disputed. Vrail's people will argue you exceeded your role under the Accord. They can argue that with the Covenant's review panel. I will win. I know you will." His arms tightened slightly. "I know you will, and your father," she said. "When will the sleep end? It is difficult to predict. Voidal sleep resolves when the vampire's blood settles, which tends to happen when the political crisis that triggered it resolves." He paused. "It is possible the Covenant's ruling will have reached him at whatever level consciousness functions during the sleep. It is possible he will wake soon. I would like to meet him," she said, "properly, not as a diplomat." Dorian went still in a particular way. As what, then? He asked. She pulled back enough to look at his face. The storm-colored eyes were very close and very full of something that waited on her answer with a quality of attention she felt in her spine. As yours, she said. The thing that happened to his face then was not a smile. Exactly, though it contained a smile. It was more the expression of a man who had been holding a question for 11 months and had just received an answer. He had not quite let himself fully believe was possible until this exact moment. It was luminous and careful and very true. That, he said, is the one thing Vrail cannot rule on, the one thing the blood laws cannot adjudicate, the one thing no conclave, regent court, or ancient compact has any standing over. Yes, she said, I thought that was rather the point. He kissed her again. There, in the sitting room of the townhouse, in the 4th district of Vienna, as the city moved outside in its ordinary human way. And this kiss was different from the one in the cave beneath the Alps. That one had been a held breath finally released. This one was something settled and decided, and entirely unguarded, the kiss of two people who have chosen each other, not in a crisis moment, but in the stillness after the crisis, which is a much more honest kind of choosing. Casimir Vrail did appeal, exactly as Dorian had said he would. The Covenant's audit lasted 4 months and was, as Dorian had also predicted, genuinely unpleasant, involving depositions from nearly 40 members of the Regent Court and a formal tribunal in Brussels that Beatrice attended in her capacity as primary witness for the succession documentation. She sat across a long table from Vrail himself at one point during the tribunal, which was not something she had anticipated. He was exactly as still and as controlled as he had always been, and he looked at her across that table with the particular regard of someone who had calculated her capabilities correctly and was recalibrating exactly what that meant, now that the calculation had not gone his way. Miss Arden, he said, you have caused considerable disruption. Heiress Arden, she said, because she had learned from the best, and I have upheld the Accord's founding purpose, which I would characterize as the opposite of disruption. He looked at her for another moment. You are very much like your grandmother, he said. It sounded neither like a compliment nor an insult, purely an observation, the way very old things sometimes observed patterns. Thank you, she said, because she chose to receive it as a compliment, and he could decide what to do with that. The Covenant ruled against Vrail on all substantive counts. His regency was formally dissolved. He was required to submit a full accounting of all decisions made during his tenure to an independent monitoring panel. He was not imprisoned, because the blood laws did not permit it for a sitting former regent whose actions had remained technically within their coded limits, even if outside their spirit. But his standing within the De Vries court was gone completely, and he was removed from all positions of authority. Dorian told her this over the phone the night the ruling came through, and his voice was quieter than she expected, not triumphant. You expected to feel more satisfied, she said. I expected to feel something cleaner, he said. He genuinely believed he was protecting the court. He was wrong, and he was willing to do wrong things in the service of his belief. But he was not simply malicious. It is harder to be glad about the defeat of someone who thought they were right. She thought about this. That might be the most genuinely principled thing I have ever heard anyone say. Do not make me sound noble. I am also deeply relieved. Both things can be true. Both things are true, he agreed. Dorian's father, King Aldrich De Vries, woke from the voidal sleep 17 days after the Covenant's final ruling was delivered to the estate. Dorian told Beatrice the morning it happened, a phone call at 6 in the morning that she answered half asleep and immediately became alert for. "He is awake," Dorian said. "He is disoriented and demanding to know why there is an international covenant monitoring panel eating from his kitchens, but he is awake." She laughed before she was fully conscious enough to manage it. And he asked me to tell him everything, which has taken several hours. And then he asked me who the Arden woman was, specifically. A pause. "I told him you were the person who opened the seal at Vrathalton and submitted the covenant documents, and told Radu to his face that the address was being monitored when it was not." "What did he say?" Another pause, warmer. "He said that sounds like an Arden woman," Dorian said. "And then he said to bring you to meet him at the estate as soon as it was convenient. And when I said that might be some time given your schedule, he said to make it sooner." She smiled at her ceiling. "I will be there tomorrow." "He will be insufferably pleased with himself for requesting it." "That," she said, "sounds like a De Vries man." She heard clearly this time Dorian laugh. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded. The laugh of someone who had somewhere along the last 4 months learned that there were people in the room he did not need to manage himself for. And she held on to the sound of it. Aldrich De Vries was not what she had pictured, though she was not certain what she had pictured. He was very old in the way that Dorian had described, old in the sense that made other old things seem recent, and he had the same quality of authority that Dorian carried but broader in some way, the authority of someone who had ruled for long enough that it had become structural rather than performed. He was white-haired and pale and tall, which was simply what De Vries vampires looked like, and he had dark eyes that were not storm-colored like his son's, but something darker, almost black like deep water. He received her in the library, which she noted with a private pleasure, and he looked at her across the same reading table she had set her briefcase on 11 months ago on a cold October afternoon, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who was reading something. "My son," he said, "has a great deal of composure." "He does," she agreed. "He learned it from me, unfortunately. It makes it difficult to tell what he actually feels until he has felt it for quite some time. I have found that observation to be accurate," she said. The dark eyes moved across her face, with something she recognized as the De Vries family habit of paying genuine attention. "Did you know," he said, "when you drove into those mountains with him, that you would end up here?" She thought about it honestly. "I knew what I was going to do when I got there," she said. "I knew why I was going. I knew what I wanted the outcome to be." She paused. "I did not know if it would work. I thought the alternative was unacceptable, and so I acted as though it would work." "That sounds," he said, "exactly like your grandmother. So I have been told." A pause. Then, with a precision that was absolutely his son's, "She was a good woman, Eleanor Arden. She sat in that same chair in 1961 and told me that the accord was not a document but a promise, and that the Ardens did not break promises." He looked at her steadily. "You have not broken this one." She felt something press behind her eyes. She did not let it become anything visible. "No," she said, "I have not." He looked at her for another moment. "My son intends to ask you something," he said. "I am telling you so you are not caught off guard, because I suspect you dislike being caught off guard." She blinked. "Does he know you are telling me?" "He does not, but he will forgive it." Aldrich De Vries stood, which was the signal that the audience was ending. "He has forgiven me most things over the years. He is more generous than I deserve. The dark eyes held something that was unmistakably paternal warmth, contained and old and genuine. Take care of him. He will take care of you. That is all any compact needs to say. Dorian was waiting in the corridor outside the library. When she emerged, he looked at her face. He said something, he said immediately. He said you intend to ask me something, she said. An expression crossed his face that she would have described on anyone else as flustered, which on Dorian De Vries was so remarkable it nearly made her smile. He is 3 centuries old and has no concept of timing. I disagree, she said. His timing was excellent. I had exactly 90 seconds to prepare. He looked at her. She looked back at him. They were standing in the corridor of the De Vries estate, in the house she had first walked into 11 months ago on a cold October afternoon, and the light through the high windows was the particular gold of a Vienna winter afternoon, and he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced something. It was a ring. Old gold, a deep and true yellow that modern gold rarely achieved, with a stone that was neither diamond nor ruby, but something she did not recognize immediately, dark and iridescent, shifting between near black and deep blue as it caught the light. It is a stone from the old hold, he said. From Vrath Holton, the veins in the rock carry it. I had it set. He held it in his hand and looked at her with the full, unguarded expression that only she had ever seen on his face. I have been practicing what I intended to say. You do not need to practice with me, she said. I know, he paused. Beatrice Arden, you have seen me clearly since the first moment I turned around in this library, and you have never once looked away from what you saw. You have walked into mountain fortresses and sat across tables from my enemies and told necessary untruths and signed your name to documents that changed everything because you believed in me, because you believed in what we could be. His voice was very quiet and completely steady. I have loved you since the 3rd hour of a 4-hour argument that should have been a treaty negotiation. I will love you for every hour I have remaining, which is a very large number of hours, and I intend to spend them being worthy of the fact that you can see me. She took the ring from his palm. She looked at it for a moment, in the corridor light, at the stone from the old throne room that had opened when she pressed her hand to the gate, at the gold that had been made for her. Then she slid it onto her finger and looked up at him. Yes, she said. He took her hand, the one wearing the ring, and he held it in both of his. In the particular, careful way he had always held anything she gave him willingly, with a reverence that was not deference but recognition, the recognition of someone who understands the value of what they have been given. There are still blood law complications, he said. I know. The court will require formal protocols for a human consort. I have been drafting them for 3 months. Of course you have. The mouth curve again, fully achieved now. The covenant will have opinions. I have argued with you for 11 months, and I have argued with Vrail, and I have argued with a Brussels tribunal, and I find I have more than enough left in reserve for the covenant. I do not doubt it, your father approved in his way. My father, Dorian said, has been waiting for something to go right for 4 months. Do not tell him I said that. She smiled. He told me he forgives you most things. He tells everyone that. It is true. A pause. And then something settled in his face, something deep and final and fully at rest. We have a great deal of work ahead of us. We do, she agreed, rebuilding the court, the accord, the relationship between the houses. The blood law revisions alone will take years. Years, she said, is actually rather useful when one of us does not age. He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes, and what was in them now was everything she had seen there across 11 months of carefully restrained moments, all of it allowed to simply exist, unheld and unmanaged, visible. "I will never stop being grateful," he said, "that you could always see me." She reached up with her free hand and touched the line of his jaw, the way he had touched her face in the cave beneath the Alps, light and deliberate. "I know," she said. "I have been grateful since the beginning that you let me." Outside the estate, Vienna moved in its ordinary way, all human noise and city life, above a hidden world that was older and stranger, and was now, thanks to an ancient throne and a briefcase full of documents, and a human heiress who did not flinch, moving towards something new. The winter light lay across the estate gardens in long gold lines, and the day was cold and clear and full of the particular quality of air that comes after a long-held thing has finally been let go. Inside the corridor, Dorian De Vries, heir to the most ancient vampire bloodline in Europe, held the hand of the woman who had always been able to see him and felt, for the first time in 3 centuries, fully visible, not just to her, not just to the blood-bound subjects who now could not look through him, not just to the Covenant's formal register or his father's approving dark eyes or the journalist who had been waiting 3 years for Beatrice to give her something good, not to the court or the blood laws or the ancient compact in the mountain hold. To himself, she had done that. Not by opening any gate or signing any document, though she had done both of those things with characteristic precision and grace. She had done it simply by looking at him consistently and clearly and without looking away across 11 months of carefully managed distance, until the distance became impossible to maintain. That was the thing he could not have written into any blood law, could not have argued before any tribunal, could not have claimed from any throne made of black stone, the thing that was not political or supernatural or ancient in any way he had a language for. It was simply this. The right person had seen him clearly, and he had let her. The rest, as Beatrice Arden would have said, was just preparation. The spring brought changes to the De Vries court that moved through the old bloodlines like weather, new protocols, new alliances, and for the first time in the estate's long history, a human voice in the formal structures of a vampire household. Beatrice worked alongside the court's remaining council members with the same careful authority she had always carried, and they learned, as people who underestimated her tended to learn, that careful and quiet was not the same as small. Aldrich De Vries presided over the formal compact of standing, a new agreement between the De Vries court and the Arden Accord, in the grand hall of the estate on a Tuesday in March, when the snow was still on the ground outside and the old chandeliers threw their gold light across the assembled faces of a court that was finding its footing again. Beatrice signed her name to the document as Heiress of the Accord, and then as something else, a title the blood law scholars had debated for weeks and resolved by consulting a text that had not been opened since the 17th century, the formal title for a human of standing who had entered into permanent bond with a vampire heir, Connor of the blood, granted by treaty, unbreakable by court ruling, recognized by the international covenant, carrying its own protections under the blood laws, its own standing in the diplomatic record, and its own precedent for every case that came after. Dorian stood beside her as she signed, visible to everyone in the room, the white-haired vampire prince who had walked through a crowd of 300 of his subjects and been seen by only one person. He watched her sign with that attention he had always given her, and when she lifted the pen, he took it gently from her hand and signed his own name beside hers. The hall was silent for a moment. Then Aldrich de Vries nodded, once with the gravity of a very old king ratifying something he had not quite known he was waiting for, and the court, all at once, acknowledged its heir. In the courtyard of the estate afterward, in the cold March air, with the first suggestion of something warming in it, Dorian found her standing near the stone wall, looking out at the gardens, and he came to stand beside her in the comfortable way they had established over months of townhouse kitchens and Brussels tribunals and long drives on mountain roads. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it. "Like something has been properly finished," she said, "like a document that had been open for 200 years, just had its final clause signed." "My grandmother would agree with that description," he said. "Both our grandmothers, I think." She looked at the gardens, at the bare branches just beginning to show the faint first color of buds. "Dorian, yes, I want to go back to Vrathalton sometime, not for any political reason. I just want to see the throne room again in a context that is not urgent." He turned to look at her profile. "The rock in the walls," he said, "the stone I had made into your ring. There is more of it there. I know, it is extraordinary. I could show you the rest of the old hold. There are rooms no one has been in for centuries. A library, I think, though I am not certain what condition it is in." A pause, "and no Casimir Vrail to account for." "And no Casimir Vrail," she agreed. She turned to face him. "Soon, soon," he said. He put his arm around her in the courtyard of the De Vries estate, and she leaned against him in the cold spring air, and Vienna carried on around them in its ordinary human way, and beneath it and alongside it and threaded through it, ancient and ongoing and no longer hidden, the world they had between them continued, warm and specific and entirely their own. Above it all, in the quiet of the sealed mountain, the old throne sat in its blue-lit room, and the symbols on its stone were dark and at rest, their purpose finished. The heir was visible, the compact was signed. The long invisible thing had been seen. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.